And we begin. We're on chapter 13 of Sefer Shmuel Bet, and we're going to go right into it. Thanks for being here. As we always say, if you're new and finding us only on YouTube, please subscribe to our channel. Please give us a like, and please send your link to someone else if you think they would benefit from it. Let's put this up on the screen. Okay. Let's put that up. Yeah. And we begin. First, let's remember, these are going to be a little big. Okay. First, let's remember at the end, there were 2 or 3 things I wanted to perhaps show you at the end of the last chapter before we get back to Amnon and Tamar. When David stopped fasting because his baby died, we were told, and we didn't look at the commentators, and I wanted to show you 2 or 3 before we move forward. David consoled his wife Bat Sheva. He went to her and lay with her. She bore a son, and that became Shlomo. He sent a message through the prophet Natan, and so on and so forth. Okay. I wanted to show you just 2 or 3 last commentaries on that. We have it, Shmuel 12:20. Let's just get the spot that we go over, Doc. So first of all, Radak commented, Vayakam David Meha'aretz, that David had gotten up after the baby died, and he washed, changed his clothes, and he sat down to eat. And as I told you, and Radak brings it out, Harachitza v'hasicha v'chiluf habigadim asur la'avel b'mei avelo. The idea of washing and rinsing and putting on fresh new clothes, that's forbidden for someone who is coming out of, who's in the middle of avelut. Okay. Somebody, well, we have some people coming in. Just get this in. Okay. Let's get those in. Okay. Sorry. Okay. It is forbidden for people in Avelut who are mourning during the 7 days like of Shiva. They're not allowed to wash, rechitza, sicha. They're not allowed to anoint, that's to put on creams and ointments, v'chiluf habegadim. They're not allowed to put on fresh clothes. I taught you that. It's asur la'avel b'mei avelo. I taught you that orally, but I didn't show it to you in text. V'hecha sa'atam David. So how is it that David could do it? Yesh lefaresh ki kodem agvura asaken. One possibility, Radak says, because it is inconceivable that David would have done some of the things forbidden during Shiva, during a week of Avelut, of mourning. Just inconceivable that he would not have done Shiva properly. So one possibility is maybe he did it before the burial. People sometimes ask, they don't know, so it's my job to help them know. Shiva begins when people come home from the burial. So let's say, God forbid, someone died on Monday, and the burial is Tuesday. Monday, they don't sit Shiva. If the burial is Tuesday at 4 p.m., they don't sit Shiva Tuesday morning or early afternoon. They go to the burial site. After burial, Shiva still has not started until they get home and sit. Now, because the laws of Shiva, from the word shiva, 7, that the mourners sit for 7 days, and although it's meaningful and appropriate to mourn for 7 days and not look for shortcuts, there's no great mitzvah to impose greater inconvenience and sorrow and discomfort just because of the enormity of the loss. Like if you're enormously in pain and sorrow for 6 days and 18 hours, as long as you're following halakha, that's okay too. And therefore, it is recommended. And it's my job, for example, to recommend that, using our example, if someone died on Monday morning, 5 a.m., and the burial is going to be Tuesday at 4 p.m., a day and a half later, we recommend to them, Shiva did not begin yet, because the burial did not happen. Burial happened at Tuesday at 4 p.m. Shiva does not begin until the person starts to sit. We recommend get home before sunset, before candle lighting time, that it would be on Friday, and sit. Just sit on a couch or a chair, just sit for even 5 minutes. And now you have fulfilled, we say to that person, sitting Shiva the first day of the 7th. That Tuesday at 5:30 p.m., when candle lighting and sunset is at 6 p.m., having now set half an hour, 10 minutes before sunset, it counts that person sat the first day of Shiva, that Tuesday, 5 p.m., back it up, all of Tuesday into the previous Monday night. That's a whole day of Shiva. Monday night into Tuesday, 5 p.m., 6 p.m., that's the first of the 7 days of Shiva. So important to know that Shiva begins when the person sits, and the person sits, even if it's the last moments of the Jewish day, it goes retroactively back to the beginning of that day, even though the beginning of that day, the previous day at night, burial had not yet taken place. And that's when Shiva begins. Next question, when does Kaddish begin? And Kaddish begins likewise. First day of Kaddish is at the cemetery, which effectively is the Shiva day, first day. And then when people come in later and they say, so Kaddish began on Tuesday or Wednesday, to give a date, but mom died 2 days earlier, 3 days earlier. Mom died and it took 2 days or 3 days to do the burial because we had to wait for Uncle Mike to come from Israel, and we had to wait for Aunt Sarah to come from Jersey. And so we went as fast as we could, but in honor of the deceased, halakha would allow the extra day wait, even though burial's supposed to be right away. But halakha would allow the extra day's wait for the honor of the deceased, for the people to come. And it should be done in consultation with a rabbi. And when the people come and ask me, so just again to make it, January 1, the person died. January 4, the person was buried and Shiva began. And that's when we started saying Kaddish. Rabbi, when's the yahrzeit Kaddish? For the rest of time, annually, when we have to say Kaddish on yahrzeit, is it the anniversary of the burial, the Hebrew equivalent of January 4? Or is it the anniversary of the death, the Hebrew equivalent of January 1? And the answer is the Hebrew equivalent of January 1, the date of death. So yahrzeit, which literally means yor is German and Yiddish for year, zeit is for time of year time. The yahrzeit is the day of death in the Hebrew calendar, not the secular calendar. And the day of, but the 11 months of Kaddish starts not from the day of death, from the day of burial. Just want to flesh that out because we always try to make it our business to learn pertinent halacha that comes up. We continue. So Kaddish began, and your Shiva began at that moment. Let's continue. Let's get it back on the screen. Okay. And that's why David was allowed, with a baby having died, David was allowed, according to Radak, to be washing and rinsing and changing clothes because he did it before the burial. So if the baby died, I'm just making this up, if the baby died Monday at 2 p.m., and if the burial was Tuesday at 11 a.m., David would have been allowed, if he were sitting shiva, at 9 a.m. on Tuesday to do all those things, because burial had not yet been done, so shiva had not yet begun. David, how could it be that David did those things? Yesh lefaresh ki kodem kivura asaken. Well, one possibility we could say is that he did it before the burial. Shalom chayev adayin ba'avelut, because he was not yet obligated halachically in mourning. And because he was determined, even with the bad, we thank God. We accept God's judgment. There's a bracha. A bracha is, if you think of the wording of a bracha, it's happy wording. You're blessed are you, O God. Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam. You are blessed. You say that when you're acknowledging something good, but the wording ends with Dayan ha'emet, the true judge. And that bracha is recited at times of great tragedy, like at a burial. Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, Dayan ha'emet, the true judge. David was intent on going to, there was not yet a Beit HaMikdash, but to the holy place where they prayed, the Mishkan in the meantime, and the Aron and everything. And he wanted to be dressed properly, and he wanted to be clean and purified to enter God's house in the highest state of purity. So he made it his business, according to Radak, to do all that before Shiva kicked in with the burial. So by the time David went into the Mishkan, it might even have been the time of Shiva. Rachatz v'sach v'chalav smalot. So he washed, anointed, and changed clothes, shechayav adam levarech al ha'ra'ah, because a Jew is obligated to recite a blessing also for the bad. L'hodot et Hashem, to praise God, understanding that God is in charge. And God knows what's best. And we cannot comprehend what is best. And as someone who has sustained my own severe personal losses in my life, I have no problem with this. I have a problem and I have no problem. Emotionally, it's a killer. But intellectually, of course, it's the core of what I believe. And I tell you about me because I'm talking about you as well. Don't want to start naming name by name on our screen, but that's what we believe. That it's all, that October 7th, what the Arabs did, that was part of God's plan. Yes, we would like to think it could have been prevented. We would like to think, and maybe it would have been that if the security forces and if the police had responded, and there were no police there, and there was no army there, right on the border with Gaza, nobody was there, everyone was asleep at the wheel. So one way to absolutely understand it is that there are a whole bunch of people to blame and to be fired, and perhaps one or two people to be thrown into prison for dereliction. A deeper story for another place and time. Nevertheless, it was God's will. And if whatever everybody had done their job, it still was God's will. Either it was God's will that everybody did not do their job, or maybe it would have been that it would have happened in the northern border with Hezbollah. I don't know. That starts getting into, we can't know. But when bad things happen, I lost my father when I was 14 to leukemia. I lost my previous wife, Zichrona Livracha. It is what we accept it. We accept it. We say, Baruch Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam dayan ha'emet, that everything is from God. And I'll say 90% to 98% of my life, which I want to guess is true of your lives as well. I would say 98% of my bad experiences turned out for the best. They really did. 1,000,000% so. I just don't have the time now. I've probably mentioned little pieces in the past. That things that were disasters, 5 years later, the best thing that ever happened in my life. But there are one or two things I can't work out. I could even work out the Holocaust. I can't work out losing my father at age 14 and losing Ellen. Can't work it out. And I say it about me because I am going to assume it's true for everybody, that there are certain things we just can't work out. But we accept it's God's will, and that's how we work it out. For whatever his reason, he's got a bigger plan. We do believe in the world to come, and we believe the world to come is eternity. So if you lose 5 or 10 years in this earth, part of working it out is understanding we're talking about a lot of years ahead. But this is it. So we continue. So that's Radak on David HaMelech doing things that surprise us. Likewise, having marital relation with Bat Sheva, because that's not done either. We're going to get to that in a second in commentary. So, Chayav Adam Levarech al Ra'ah, a person is obligated to bless God for bad, Lehodot et Hashem, Ulekabel b'simcha, to praise God and accept it with an aspect of happiness. Kashem shehu mevarech ala tova, in the same way that you praise God, Baruch Hashem Elokeinu Machlam Hatov v'Hametiv, who is good and constantly is good, just as we praise for the good. Shnemar Chesed Mishpat Ashira, Im Chesed Ashira, Im Mishpat Ashira. It says in Psalms that written by King David, I will sing for both chesed, acts of God's grace, and acts of God's judgment. And the same way. So we're going to move on a little bit some more here. He harachitza v'sicha lo hayata b'yom hamita el aralayla sh'acharei she'en chayav ba'avelut min haTorah el yom mita bovat. So, okay, that gets into taking you through a little bit more understanding that I won't get into that too much, but he says that actually it's rabbinic that we do 7 days, and the Uriah, the Torah, is only 1 day of Shiva, not 7 days. It wouldn't be called Shiva. It would be called Avelut, 1 day of Avelut. That was the Uriah. That's literally the Torah law, but the rabbis made it a 7-day week. So anyway, I don't want to get through all of it, but I do want to make out one more point that I talked about. Kitoch shaloshim yom l'leidato met hayeled. The baby died within the first 30 days of life. V'hu safek nefel. That puts the baby in a halachic status where we're not sure whether the baby reached the point of being a living human being per se, or still was regarded as a fetus that just came out a little early. Im nolad lishmona. So there are all these different questions, and therefore David's actions, which we did not even focus on. We were focused on what you might call the big picture, but we also understand we're learning Jewish law. We're not just learning how a famous Jew acted, but we're finding the sources of the laws that we do. Like, where does it say this at Shiva? Where do we get these things? We get them from sources like how David acted when his baby died. Truly, when Aharon Kohen went through the terrible tragedy that 2 of his sons died at the inauguration of the Mishkan, Nadav and Avihu. So we learned partly from how Aharon reacted when his sons died. We learned some of the laws of mourning from that. When Moshe Rabbeinu died, the nation mourned for him. We learned from that. When Aharon died, when he went on Hor Hahar, the nation waited for him. We learned from that. We learned from that Avraham, when Sarah died, Avraham recited a hesped, a eulogy, Lispod l'Sarah v'livkota. We learned from that. So sources like 7 days, 30 days of Shloshim, it's not a Chumash law. There's nowhere of the 613 per se. Those laws are not, thou shalt sit Shiva 7 days. have shloshim, 30 days. Not tear clothing upon death. There's no such commandment. Where did it come from? From learning these stories, these actual life experiences. These are where some of our laws come from. Not all the 613 are necessarily written out that way. And so, for example, when Yaakov Avinu heard, apparently Yosef had died, destroyed by a wild animal, he tore his garment. That's where we learn tearing garments. The nation waited 7 days for Miriam when she had leprosy. That's one of the sources of 7 days. Waited 30 days upon the death of Aharon. We learn shloshim that way, and so on and so forth. So that's where these laws come from. So that's why it's a little dereliction by me if we just go through the death of the baby without learning the halacha that comes with it. And so, okay, we go forward. But there's the other question that I was about to comment on is how could he have intimacy, physical intimacy with Bat Sheva? Because it says that soon after the baby died, it says, let's find it. So you had that discussion, and then should have done it the other way. I had it the other way. Let's just go back to that. That was it. So we learned Vayinachem David et Bat Sheva Ishto, that David comforted Bat Sheva, Vayavo Eleha, and he was physically intimate. And that Vayishkav Ima, he lay with her, meaning what it means, and that's where Shlomo came. So the question again is, you're not allowed to be physically intimate during Shiva. So we learn a halacha from that David, as with the other things, either did it before burial, and that might seem quite emotionally unusual, but that's what he did. Or it means, in the alternative, he didn't do it immediately after the baby died, but that the baby, having not lived 30 days, did not generate the halachic requirements of Shiva. So it would have been permitted to do all those things, including being intimate with his wife, after the baby died, because the baby technically was considered a fetus, which has life. Orthodox Torah Judaism is not liberal on abortion. We don't want to go into that. That's a whole other thing. But we're not liberal on abortion. We don't say that until it came out, it's not a life. It's a life. A fetus is a life, and there's a lot of halach on that. Oh boy. But for our purposes here, a fetus is not as much a life as a complete life. And in terms, for example, of generating the laws of Shiva, a fetus does not generate the laws of Shiva. And therefore, that would have been a reason it would be permitted. There are more commentary than that. Let's take a quick look at, because let's just really get this all together. So that was on 1220, I believe. Radak on 1220. So we were just doing that, and just take one moment. Okay. So as far as his intimacy with Bat Sheva, so we learn more here. Nichem David et Ishto. David consoled his wife. Nechama, you know that word perhaps, consolation. Shelo titz ta'er. She had reason to be very upset, not only having lost a baby. We sometimes, this is like a lot of stuff going on here. Think back to if you've ever watched some of the historic movies, historic fiction, from British monarchs in the Middle Ages. The Henry VIII movies, Lady Jane Grey, all these movies. In the British monarchy, we had a lot of different sons, sometimes from different queens, Henry VIII. And they would know that when the father dies, there will be a fight for who gets to be the new king. It's not like the modern British, where everybody knew it would be Charles and everybody knows who goes next. And that's why the other one goes to Oprah. But in those days, everyone was ready to make a push that I'm the king, that my brother was born to my father's least favorite wife or least worthy wife. And my mother was the most loved or the best or the holiest. And everybody got ready and they had some horrible fights. And there were executions, beheadings all over the place. Here, there was something potentially just like that, believe it or not. Here are these Jews, we're learning about the greatest of our ancestors in the Bible, Shmuel Bet. When David had Absalom was willing to kill whatever to become the next king, even when his father was alive. And then when David was about to be dead, another of his sons, Adoniyahu ben Chagit, he declared himself king. And that's where Bat Sheva got panicky. While David was on his deathbed, she came to him in his deathbed, begging him to declare that Shlomo, her son, would be the next king. Because if you don't get quoted now with witnesses designating him as the next king, Adoniah he's already made his move. He's going to become king, and he's going to kill Shlomo, and he's going to kill me. So this is not just about politics and who's going to be next, and the other one doesn't get to be. He'll kill his half-brother, and he'll kill his whatever stepmother or whatever. He'll kill Bat Sheva. So that's the thing, it seems so glorious and great. I'm married to the king. I live in the palace. I can get all the food I want, and everybody takes care of me, and I'm just treated like the queen, even if there are 7 of us. It's just a delightful life. It's very dangerous also, because if you're not the queen whose son becomes the king, you could end up getting killed, getting executed by the one who becomes the king. And this happens, it's going to happen in several places, variations on that in Tanakh that we learn. We've also learned some in the book of Judges, in Shoftim. So here likewise, you have the scenario. Let's get that off, okay? So Nichem David et ishto shelo titzta'er v'lo tivkeh al hayeled. First, he's comforting and consoling Bat Sheva. She shouldn't cry that the baby died, but to help comfort her. Now, secondly, the text tells us that he went into her. It's to tell us that's where the second son came from. It had told us only that he had been intimate with her one time, and there's a baby, and the baby died. So where did Shlomo come from? So the text goes out of its way to tell us that David became intimate with her, so we would know where Shlomo, like what's that all about? That it was some kind of miracle that David had been intimate one time with Bat Sheva, the baby came out and died, and what happened? Did another one just like pop out by miracle, either a delayed twin or popped out a few days later, also like a miracle that they didn't know he was in there? So that's why the Torah tells us, Radak says, the Tanakh tells us that he was intimate a second time. So we understand that. Why? V'ratzon hakel haya. This was God's will. Why? Achar sheDavid asa teshuvah. After David repented, and we've learned a lot about his repentance, the dedication, the devoutness, and the extent of his teshuvah. V'nichem al chet'o, the degree to which he begged God for forgiveness for sin, the Uriah sin, that it's to tell us that this also became a symbol that it's forgiven, that God, having punished him a lot of punishments, one of which the death of this baby, that we're told by symbol that the punishment, that component of the punishment is done because now a new healthy baby has been born right afterwards. So on the one hand, Sheson'o lefi shenotsar ba'avon vehemito. V'yesh lamid divrei Rabbeinu. One more thing. Just try this. We'll leave that up. We'll go on to a new one. So those were some of Radak's comments that I wanted to share with you on that pasuk. Now on 24, let's get that one. There's a second thing going on here, that Bat Sheva was afraid that, as I just spoke about it a moment ago, the other sons are going to do a job on her. The other sons were born before Shlomo. Everybody knows what happened between David and Bat Sheva, including all the other sons. They may regard her as a woman of very low morals. It wasn't her fault per se. We've learned all about that, so we won't go into that again. But she was as much a victim as anything else, as we learned how he sent emissaries to her home to pull her out of her home, bring her into the palace, etc. And she was horrified. One of these days, you're going to die, and you're going to leave me with these other sons of yours, all vying to be the king, and they're not going to let my son be the king, and they're going to kill me. And even if they don't kill me, they're going to treat me like a slave, or throw me out, because they're going to look upon me as a woman of ill repute who, wrangled their father, and it's going to be horrible. So, Tamar ishto ki chavar met Uriah, aval mitchila amar isha yolda eshet Uriah leDavid. Okay. So we've learned the story about how Bat Sheva was married to Uriah. Uriah got divorced in the procedural way that was done when men went out to war. And so the question is, did they ever become married again? No. It seems like what happened is she was married to Uriah, ki eshet Uriah hayata ad shemet. She was married to Uriah until he died. And Radak says, this is Radak, umatzati sefer acher ketiv isho v'kari ishto. He says that, as you know, the word for his wife is isha shalo ishto, but there happens to be another volume, another manuscript that he saw, the Radak saw, in which it refers to her as Bat Sheva Isho, and he comments on it. He says that I found because that would happen, because, Radak is centuries after the Navi was written. And just as we are doing, he was sitting and reading the Navi and learning the Navi, and then he was writing a commentary. And unlike today, where you have all these bound volumes and you can order them on Amazon or you can buy them in the bookstore, I mean, it was quite a thing to find manuscripts. And so he's saying, Matzati Sefer Acher, I found another manuscript where the word Ishto, when it refers to Bat Sheva, is his wife, it says Isho, which is, well, what's that? That Isho, it could mean his fire. It could be a misspelling. Remember, the Torah has no misspellings. If there's any question on a word, how it's spelled in the Torah, we preserve that spelling, even if it seems wrong. If a letter in the Torah is rubbed out, in shul, the Baal Kriya, the one reading the Torah, points to the Gabbai or the rabbi, this letter is rubbed out, and they immediately take the Torah off the table, they roll it up, and they bring it to a sofer, a scribe, to put that letter back in, to fix it. We don't make the slightest change in a Torah. Any quote-unquote misspellings, we believe God told Moshe Rabbeinu, write it and spell it that way, because the so-called misspelling is to teach something extra. An example, it says, just one example, it says in the Torah that tefillin should be worn on al yodcha, that ukashartem liot al yodcha. and you shall bind it as an os, as a sign, on yodcha, your hand. Yodcha is spelled very simple. Yud Daled Chaf Sofit. Yud Daled, Yad, hand. And when you add a cha at the end, that means your. Hayad shalcha, yadcha. The hand of yours, your hand. You shall bind the tefillin on your hand. Which hand, left or right? One of the 4 places in the Torah where the law of tefillin appears, only one, because the other 3, it's spelled right. But it's spelled wrong in one place. Yud Daled Chaf Hey. Instead of Chaf Sofit, final Chaf with an aw, a kamatz, Chaf Hey. Chaf with an aw below it, and a silent Hey. Yodcha. And it has the same meaning. But it's misspelled, so to speak, to teach a second halacha. It says, Al tikri yadcha, ela yad keha. The word keha, kaf, hey, and another hey, means weak. Yad keha, you shall put the tefillin on your weak hand. And that's how they learn that tefillin for a righty goes on the left arm, and for a lefty goes on the right arm. So when there's a misspelling in the Torah, and again, I use the word misspelling, so to speak, it's preserved. It's never changed. You're not allowed to make it right. Don't fix God's Torah. If the letter's worn out, bring it to the scribe to fix it. But we preserve every so-called misspelling because there are laws we learn from the misspelling. But in the Navi, that was not dictated by God to Moshe or to anyone word for word. We believe the Navi was written by certain great people by Ruach HaKodesh, divine inspiration. For example, Yehoshua wrote the book of Joshua. And Shmuel, Samuel, wrote the book of Samuel 1, 1 Samuel, and the book of Judges, Shoftim, and the book of Ruth. Yirmiyahu wrote the book of Kings 1 and 2. And he wrote Eicha, and he wrote additional. And we believe that Shlomo HaMelech, King Solomon, wrote Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, and Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs, and also several other. So those were all written by the likes of King Solomon, Shmuel Hanavi, Yehoshua, Yirmiyahu, but it wasn't simply like I'm sitting and writing something. I write the Friday Torah commentaries. We believe that those were written by Ruach HaKodesh, that God put the words in their minds, but not that God dictated word for word, letter for letter. That's only Moshe Rabbeinu for the Torah. That is why if a letter is missing in the Torah, we stop reading from it, we get it fixed. If a letter is worn out or rubbed out from even a Megillah, that's coming up real soon, or from any book of Navi, we don't have to get the volume fixed, or you could continue using it the way it is. Okay. So he's talking about that he found it different ways. V'chipasti b'sfarim meduyakim v'lo matzati kain. And then Radak says, so what I did was I went and I got more manuscripts because there's 2 spellings that I really wanted to know. Is one of them a Scrivener's error and the other one the right way? And so I looked both ways, and he starts talking about all the trouble he went through till he finally figured out that it's meant to be the way it's spelled, that it's Ishto. And I'm just sharing with you again some of this esoterica because it's actually incredibly informative as to how the Navi and the Torah are written. Okay, we continue. So we continue with the Ralbag commenting now on, as we get into an interesting halacha that we might have missed as well. There's the Ralbag on 25. There's a halacha, echad laboel, ve'echad labaal. If a man is married to a wife and he commits adultery, and with a woman who's also committing adultery, and let's say it's private, nobody knows about it, or there wasn't for some other reason, did not fall into the category where the bet din gets involved. There weren't two kosher witnesses. Um, there weren't proper warning in advance, any of these things. But he's committed adultery, and the lady's committed adultery. And while they can't punish him for it, his wife finds out and she gets divorced. She wants a divorce, there's a divorce. According to halakha, that man, the adulterer, may remarry if his wife leaves him, or in biblical times with polygamy, may marry other women anyway, but he may never marry that woman. And that adulterous woman may never marry that guy. Let's say his wife dies, his true wife dies, just natural causes. So now he's a widower, and now there's no issue. He can marry her. No, he can't. Echad laboel ve'echad labal. According to Jewish law, if a man commits adultery, he may never marry the woman with whom he committed adultery, and the woman may never marry him. And the commentary is going to teach us this is one last final proof that David did not commit a sin of adultery when he had intimacy with Bat Sheva while she was married to Uriah. That he was no longer married to Uriah. Uriah had handed her a divorce, and therefore she was an unmarried woman, at least technically by law. Because if she had still been married, then then it would have been adultery, and David never would have been allowed to marry her later, much less by God's word. God sent the prophet Natan, the prophet Nathan, to tell him to console his wife, meaning to be physically intimate, and their husband and wife. The fact that Natan the Navi, speaking on behalf of God, gave a heter permission for David, in fact, encouragement for David to be physically intimate with Bat Sheva is a final, people will miss it if we don't think about it, but it's a final proof that there was no God would not have allowed it, even if the whole public never knew. So what we've been learning, it's one more proof that there was not adultery at the time. It is worth, Ralbag saying, it's worthwhile explaining to you that David did not commit a sin by being intimate with an adulteress, with someone else's married wife, after Uriah died and Bat Sheva became a widow, so it was clear sailing for David to marry her in secular terms. This is to bring out to you that he was allowed to, he did not sin. Ki ha'holech lemilchemet beit David get kritut kotev lishto, because as we learned, when you went to war in David's time, you wrote a bill of divorce, v'achar shemet b'milchama, nitba'er ha'inyan lemafreya, shelo hayata eshet Uriah. So after Uriah died in battle, everybody finally came to know that Uriah had already divorced his wife. She was not married to him, kishaba aleha David, when David was intimate with her. She'imlo hayahinyan kach, because if these were not the facts as described, ech lo tzivahu HaKadosh Hashem yitbarach, how would it be that God would give a command al yadei neviel by via his navi, his prophet, she'azva v'ha'isha mizaneh asura labal. How could it be? Because a true zona, a true prostitute, or with a married man, or an adulteress, is forbidden to her husband. V'asur laboel, asur labal, v'asur laboel is forbidden to her husband, and is forbidden to the adulterer. The motion is by a Baal is a master, also a husband. Boel is someone who essentially rapes, or otherwise does the intimacy act in a forbidden way. And how would it be that God so much loved that little baby that was born to David and to Bat Sheva, that God gave him another name. Not only did they name him Shlomo, but God said, I also want to name him Yedidya, my beloved. Yedid is beloved. Yedidya, beloved of God. V'ratzah shetiyeh mimenu hamamlacha. And God wanted specifically that one, Dafka, that one, to be the next king. So, Aval, Al kol panim ro'eh shenamin, ki lo chata David b've'ilat Bat Sheva. So we see, there's just no question about it, that David did not commit an actual sin when he was intimate with Bat Sheva. Achar shekavar neharag bidvar hamilchama, after Uriah died at war. V'hinei lulei maher David hinei hayatalo Bat Sheva lisha. Okay, David should not have married her so fast. He should have waited longer. Asher nishba Hashem shetiyel David, because actually she was meant ultimately to marry David. That was God's plan. The Talmud tells us, for the purposes of time, I'll save a moment now, won't go into it. But the Talmud tells us that from the beginning of time, God's plan was that David would marry Bat Sheva. How would he come to marry Bat Sheva? He had no way to know it. I had no way to know it. You had no way to know it. Uriah was going to die at war anyway. Had David not sent a message to Yoav, his general, to put Uriah up at the wall and be the first line, and Uriah was going to die at that war no matter what. And Bat Sheva was going to be a widow, and David was going to marry her. And nobody knew it. So this was part of God's plan. And it got messed up. It ended up it's sort of the way I talked earlier in class tonight, that he has his plans and things are going to happen a certain way because he's got the big picture. We don't have that big picture. It may be, of course it is. All of American history would have been different if John Kennedy were not assassinated. Or would it have? Or how else might it have happened? If Kennedy had not been assassinated, and Nixon, therefore, no, he was out anyway, and Johnson maybe Vietnam would have been handled differently, or since Johnson is the one who mostly handled Vietnam, Janet, please make a note of your question. I'll take it at the end. And so maybe since Johnson would have handled Vietnam anyway, things might have gone differently, or maybe something else would have happened differently. If there had not been the national trauma of the assassination 5 years later of Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy, maybe Bobby Kennedy was going to die anyway. Martin Luther King might have ended up with cancer. Bobby Kennedy might have ended up with some disease. Things happened, and all of history might have come out the same way with Trump as president, or maybe Trump would not have been president. Maybe different things would have happened. Maybe everything we're living through is irrelevant in terms of God's even bigger plan. I've told you many, many times that Yosef HaTzadik, Joseph, told his brothers when they came begging for food and they all moved to Egypt, Joseph said, you see, don't feel bad you sold me into slavery. That was God's plan, so that I would be in a position to save the family at the time of the famine. And Joseph himself did not know that that was not God's main plan. He thought he now figured out the plan, God's plan. God's main plan was to get all the Jews out of Canaan, away from the impurities and corruption of Canaan, so that they would go to the greatest country in the world, Egypt, be able to be placed in their own canton, Goshen, apart from the whole nation, so they could create their own holy culture and religion, because they came as only 70 people, and when they got out at the Exodus, there were 3 million. And it was there they grew from 70 to 3 million, evolved the religion. Torah had not yet been given, but the culture evolved that would be different from a Canaanite culture or an Egyptian culture until God was ready for them to go into Mount Sinai and get the laws that would formalize the laws, the rules, the Constitution. So we don't know the reasons. We never know the reasons. We've learned that when they got out, God led them on a circuitous path. One opinion we've learned, I shared it on a Friday, was to avoid going through Canaan and ending up in a war on the way of the Philistines, to end up in a war with the Philistines in order to get to the Promised Land. But there are other reasons. Another reason is given that if they, by going circuitously, they would have to go via the Red Sea, and that would create Kriyat Yam Suf, which would become maybe the greatest miracle in history for any people of any time. So God had his plan. We continue. So, continuing from that, let's just go. Now we're in chapter 13 where we left off last week, and now we get into the sources of laws that I started teaching you last week on this thing about Amnon and Tamar. So I was telling you that with Amnon and Tamar, to refresh your memories briefly, this happened sometime afterward. Avshalom, the son of David, he had sons from each of his wives. Avshalom, son of David, had a beautiful sister named Tamar. They had the same mother, Ma'acha, the Yafat Toar, the woman, the beautiful non-Jewish captive woman from war, whom David saw and desired, so he was intimate with her one time. We spent last class in detail on it, so we won't right now. And after one time, he was not allowed again to be with her unless he married her, which first required that she converted. She converted to Judaism, became Jewish. He married her and went intimately with her. And another child was born, Avshalom. So she had a daughter, Tamar, born to conceived by a non-Jewish mother. By the way, if Tamar came out of her mother's womb before Ma'acha converted, Tamar was born non-Jewish and would have to have been converted to Judaism, which clearly she was. She was Jewish. If Tamar had been conceived while her mother Ma'acha was non-Jewish, yet the mother Ma'acha, if she had converted within the next 9 months, and we went through last class why it was faster in those days, Tamar would have come out from the womb of a Jewish mother, conceived in a non-Jewish mother's womb, but born from the womb of a Jewish mother. If Tamar took 9 months, and if Ma'acha converted within those 9 months, which would have been very common in those days, for reasons we talked about last week. Either way, Tamar halachically is the daughter of Ma'acha, but as we learned last week, she has no father. Because if a Jewish man has a baby with a non-Jewish woman, not only is the baby non-Jewish following the mother's religion, but the baby has no father. And even if the baby converts later, we gave the example, if it's a boy and the boy is called up to the Torah, and we always call the boy up to the Torah, or later he becomes a man, Ya'amod, and we say his name and the name of his father. In that case, Ya'amod, we say his name and the name of his mother because he has no father. He's not an orphan who still had a father. So we would still say, Ya'amod, come up to the Torah, so-and-so, the son of the father, the deceased father. Rather, come up, so-and-so, the son of the mother, because there is zero father. All right, Tamar has no father. Tamar has a mother. Avshalom is her brother. He has the same mother, but he definitely has a father, David. So he's a full half-brother. He's a half-brother. All the other sons, David had like one son from each of 6 or 7 other wives. And every one of those boys was a brother from another mother, as they say. A brother from another mother, but all had the same father. So they all were half brothers. And they all, curiously, were allowed to marry Tamar, except for Avshalom, because all of them had different mothers from Tamar. Only Avshalom had the same mother. All the others had different mothers, so you could marry someone from a different mother, and all of them had a different father, because they all had David as a father, except for Tamar, who was a sister from a different mister. And therefore, every one of them was allowed to marry Tamar, technically under Jewish law, except for Avshalom, because he had the same mother. And Amnon was, we learned last week, just infatuated with her and wanted to do anything he could to have her. We learned that last week. So we continue now with having the text. Where do we get this idea that a man who has a Jewish man who has a child with a non-Jewish mother is not the father? And we learned this last week at some detail. It's from Exodus 21. We just read Mishpatim. Exodus 21, Sefer Shmot, Perek Chaf Aleph, just read it. It begins with a discussion of slavery, biblical slavery. I wrote about it in some detail in last Friday's Parsha that I sent to everybody. So it talks about the laws. Elah HaMishpatim, these are the Ki tikneh Eved Ivri, sheish shanim yavod. If you will buy a Hebrew slave, he can work for you up to 6 years. And we learned about it. A Hebrew slave, it's not like the black slaves in America in the 1860s and from the very beginning of time, from the days of the slave trade. And it's not like the slaves that the Muslims took from all over the world. And they pretty much created worldwide slavery with the Barbary pirates, the Barbary pirates who, Muslims who went and took slaves from everywhere, famously from Ireland and from the Slavic countries, who became known as Slavic from the word slave. In Judaism, it was very different. A slave was pretty much like a caregiver, a housekeeper, a butler for 6 years. He became a slave for one of 2 or 3 reasons. If he stole and they caught him and they convicted him, and he therefore had to pay double. So if he stole $1,000 and he now has to pay $2,000 and he doesn't have it. So Beit Din made him become the slave, namely the butler, the caregiver, housekeeper, and work off the $2,000. Let's say the value of labor was $20 an hour, whatever. He'd have to work 100 hours, and so on and so forth. But no matter how much you have to work off, when the 7th year came, he goes free. Just like Shemitah, he goes free in the 7th year. Here's our pasuk. If this Hebrew man, this Jew, who now has been sentenced by the court to be an Eved Ivri, a slave, has to go into that family's household, and he goes alone, he's single, he's not married, and then while he's a slave, the master couples him with a woman. He's got a woman, the owner has a woman slave, and the owner, well, while I've got this male slave for the next 3 years, 5 years, 6 years, I may as well breed like a horse. I can breed more slaves. And those slaves will belong to me, the master. Again, they won't be treated like the way America did its black slaves and the rest of the world, and particularly the Arab Muslims. But nevertheless, this will be a lifelong daycare person for me, caregiver, work in my fields. if I could have 2, 3 children while this man slave is here, they belong to me. In bagapo yavo, if the male Hebrew slave goes into serving his sentence as a single man, he literally can be bred, B-R-E-D. The master can take, if he has a female slave, and have this guy like breeding a horse. And I talked at great length last week, and I've talked about it so many times, that the very concept of sexual intercourse was a bunch different in biblical times. Things that we hear today based on the Jewish halakha of how we live and what's forbidden. When we hear about certain things that went on in biblical times, they challenge our preconceived notions of how Orthodox Judaism works back then. Because there were changes, stricter changes, not more lenient changes, but certain stricter changes were made. So today you could not do, as we said last week, you could not do what Sarah did, and give the maiden over to her husband to have a baby, as she did with Hagar. Or you can't have like Rachel giving over Bilhah to have Dan and Naphtali, and Zilpah and Leah giving over Zilpah to have Gad and Asher. You couldn't do that. You just couldn't do that, or the story of Yehuda and indifferent Tamar. But in biblical times, as we've learned about David and Bat Sheva, that technically it was allowed. And that people had pilagshim, people had concubines with whom they had active sexual relationships without a marriage. And it was technically allowed. It was morally frowned upon. It wasn't what a mensch does. You get married to one woman, or if you're taking advantage, a legitimate advantage of the halakha's polygamy, you marry several women. Each one gets a ketubah. If any one of them leaves, they get alimony, unlike a pelegish, a concubine. So anyway, under Jewish Torah law, if the man comes in alone, the Baal, the master, can pair him up for them every night and wherever they sleep, and have babies that belong to the master. In Bagapo Yavo, if he comes in, if the slave arrives on his own, Bagapo Yetse, he leaves on his own. That is, he does not take the kids with him. They are not his kids. It's not only that he doesn't get custody, but he's not the father. The mother is the mother. This is the source for what I've been teaching you last class and this one, about how Tamar has no father. From this pasuk that we just read last week. If he comes alone, he leaves alone. Because the slave, it's understood, he's with a slave who is, let's say, a non-Jewish woman, and she does not have the same status. In Baal Ishahu, but if he comes as a married man, and the court rules, because you're a married man and you stole that money, you're going to be a daycare or caregiver in this victim's house for the next 5 years, and your wife is going to go with you. That's her mazel. She married him. You married a guy who turned out to be a crook. He is now being sentenced to live 3 years, 2 years, 5 years, 6 years until Shemitah in the house of the guy that he robbed from, and you're going with him. And the master will have the responsibility to provide proper sleeping accommodations and food and clothing, and you can't treat them like black slaves were treated, or like the Arab Muslims when they created the slave trade. So you bring the wife with him. In Baal Ishahu, if he's a married guy when he does it, v'yotza'a ishto imo, then when his time is up, he leaves with his wife, and they take those kids. Im adonav yiten lo isha v'yolda lo v'nim avonot. If the single slave, if the master hands him a woman, to have babies with, and she gives him boys or girls. Ha'ishavila dehatiten tehiyel adoneha. That woman and the children she bears from that male slave, tehiyel adoneha, will those children belong not even to her, but to the master. V'hu yetze b'gapo, and the individual guy will leave on his own. And that's why you have that other pasuk we saw in the Torah last week. You remember how the Torah is being read every week in shul, and you're reading, and you're doing all you can to keep up with the Hebrew and maybe with the translation, but you don't really have time to get into it. Well, that's what's going on when it says, and if the slave says, I like being a slave, I like my master, and I like the lady, and I like my kids, I don't want to leave slavery. Lo eitzei chavshi. I want to remain a slave the rest of my life. And your mind quickly, you don't have time to think much because the Torah reader is up to the next pasuk already. And before you know it, he's up to the next parak, next chapter. But it's bothering you. What kind of person says, my time is up to be a slave, I don't want to leave. I want to be a slave the rest of my life. And there's that whole thing about how the master brings him to a door and to the doorpost, and he bangs he pierces the ear and everything, and then the guy is a permanent slave. He remains his master's slave for life. It's not like you get to say, I'd like to stay 1 or 2 more years. It's either not all or nothing. Mazel tov, your time is up. You go back home. You leave behind the lady, and you leave behind the kids. The lady will go free whenever she goes free, and the kids belong to the master. You say, I don't want to leave. I want to be a slave of yours forever. You come back. Why would a man do that? Because maybe the man has spent 5 years with that woman, 5 years intimately with that woman. And many people, when they're intimate for much time, become emotionally bonded. And there are those who, unfortunately, like in today's society, don't become emotionally bonded. It's an unfortunate thing that, whatever. But there are people who suddenly find themselves emotionally bonded. And on top of it, there are kids. And after 5 years, you start to like these kids. They're only a few years old. Remember, he gets out by year number 6. After 6th year is the latest, till the 7th year comes. So the kids are not going to be over age 6. You get sick of the kids when they're teenagers. And I'm saying it's half joking, but you know what I'm saying. Kids either they come up perfectly, beautifully, and they're the joy of your life, but you know what I'm saying. But those little kids, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years old, they're muttiks. That's the sweet years. So a man might feel, I really love these kids. I've been coochie coochie coo. I've been tickling them for 5 years. I've been teaching them. They said the word Abba. They said the word Ima. She and I now have some of our own inside jokes that we've come to develop. We kind of get the same stuff. We've been through the time the kid had roseola, and we've been through the time the other one broke an arm, and we rode through it. And so that's what that's about. So that's the source for the Torah telling us that when a man impregnates a woman who's not Jewish, he is not the husband. He's not the father, not the husband either. Halachically, he's neither a husband nor a father. And therefore, Tamar had no father, and therefore Tamar could marry any one of those brothers except for the only Avshalom who had the same mother. We learned this last week orally, and this week we're going into commentary, and next week we're going into the big blow-up explosion that unfolded as a result, and that almost brought down the house of David, and in certain ways brought down a good part of the house of David, though Shlomo saved the rest. We also learned tonight laws about shiva, laws about when Kaddish and shiva, when shiva begins, when Kaddish begins, when yahrzeit falls. We've learned today about the halacha of saying the bracha of Dayan Ha'emet versus the bracha of Hatov V'Hametiv. We've learned their sources. And as I said, next week we'll go forward. Thank you for being with us. Again, if you're new on YouTube, please join the channel and give us a like and send a link to people you think would enjoy it. And thank you for being